The Ottoman Empire. Chapter 1. In the 9th century, on the vast and windswept plains of Central Asia, a young Turkish boy watched his family's herds. The world for him was the endless grass, the dome of the sky, and the rhythm of the seasons. But this world was about to be taken from him. He was captured in a raid, a single life swept up in the great currents of power and migration that defined the age. His journey was long and bewildering, ending in the magnificent city of Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. Here he was given a new name, a new faith, and a new purpose. He was to become a ghulam, a slave soldier, loyal not to a tribe or a family, but to the Caliph alone. This practice, born of a need for soldiers with no prior allegiances, would echo through the centuries. It was an idea of profound consequence to create a military class whose entire identity was bound to the state. This young boy, and thousands like him, learned the arts of war, administration, and unwavering loyalty. They were the Caliph's sword, an instrument of power forged in the crucible of displacement. The idea was too powerful to remain confined to Baghdad. As Turkish peoples migrated westward, they brought this system with them. It was the Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty that came to dominate Anatolia, who would institutionalize the ghulam system on a grand scale. In their Sultanate of Rum, this corps of elite, converted soldiers became the bedrock of their power, the very model of a professional standing army. They were the force that held back the Crusaders and governed a complex, multi-ethnic land. But empires, like all living things, have a lifespan. By the late 13th century, the Seljuk Sultanate was a shadow of its former self, shattered by a far greater power from the east, the Mongols. Their invasions had fractured Anatolia into a mosaic of small, competing Turkish principalities known as beyliks. Each beylik was ruled by a chieftain, a bey, who commanded a small band of warriors. They were perched on the frontier between the Islamic world and the fading Byzantine Empire, a Christian Rome that had ruled from Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years. This was a land of opportunity and conflict, a place where fortunes were made with the sword. Among these chieftains was a man named Osman. According to tradition, his small state was founded in the year 1299. The historical records are sparse, and the man himself is shrouded in legend. But we know he ruled from the town of Sogut in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, a territory that was, at first, insignificant. What set Osman and his followers apart was not the size of their land, but the power of their purpose. They were Ghazi's warriors for the faith of Islam. Their lives were dedicated to expanding the frontiers of their world, fighting on the borderlands against the Christian Byzantines. This Ghazi ethos, a potent combination of religious zeal, warrior honor, and the promise of plunder, drew fighters from all across the Turkish world to Osman's banner. He was a canny and patient leader, building his power not through grand battles, but through slow, methodical conquest. He captured small forts, formed alliances with other Turkish chieftains, and gradually expanded his domain at the expense of his Byzantine neighbours. He was laying a foundation, stone by stone, for something far greater than a mere frontier state. When Osman died, his son Orhan continued his work. The Ottomans, as they came to be known, captured the major Byzantine city of Bursa, making it their first true capital. They crossed the Dardanelles and established their first foothold in Europe. With each generation, the Ottoman state grew stronger, more organized, and more ambitious. They were no longer a small beylik, but a rising sultanate. This astonishing growth culminated in the reign of the fourth sultan, Bayezid I. He moved with such speed and decisiveness on the battlefield that he earned the name Uldrum the Thunderbolt. Bayezid was the embodiment of this new Ottoman power. He swept through the Balkans, crushing a great Crusader army at the Battle of Nicopolis. He turned his armies eastward, conquering and absorbing the other Turkish beyliks in Anatolia, uniting the land under his singular rule. By the turn of the 15th century, he stood as one of the most powerful rulers in the world, his empire stretching from the Danube River to the Euphrates. He laid siege to Constantinople itself, the ancient prize, and it seemed only a matter of time before the city would fall to him. But as Bayezid looked west, a new storm was gathering in the east. Another world conqueror, whose ambition and ferocity matched his own, was marching toward Anatolia. He was Timur, known to the west as Tamerlane. Timur was a Turco-Mongol leader who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. From his capital in Samarkand, he had carved out a vast and terrifying empire through decades of brutal warfare. He saw Bayezid's expanding empire as a challenge to his own supremacy. A confrontation was inevitable. Two titans, each believing himself the chosen instrument of God's will, were set on a collision course. In the hot summer of 1402, their armies met on the plains near Ankara. It was one of the largest battles of the medieval world. Bayezid the Thunderbolt, confident in his invincible army, faced Timur's veteran forces. The battle was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. The turning point came when the Turkish soldiers, recently conquered by Bayezid from the other beyliks, saw their former princes riding in Timur's ranks. Their loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan was shallow. They switched sides in the midst of the fighting, and the Ottoman lines collapsed. In the chaos and the slaughter, Sultan Bayezid was captured. The Thunderbolt, the great conqueror who had made Europe tremble, was now a prisoner in Timur's camp. The humiliation was absolute. He would die in captivity less than a year later, a broken man. The Battle of Ankara did more than just destroy an army. It shattered an empire. Timur had no interest in ruling Anatolia. After plundering the land, he turned back east, leaving a power vacuum in his wake. The Ottoman state, so painstakingly built over 4 generations, disintegrated almost overnight. What followed was a dark and desperate period known as the Ottoman interregnum. It was a decade-long civil war, a brutal struggle for survival. The sons of Bayezid, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed each claimed a piece of the ruined empire and turned on one another. The hard-won unity of the state was gone, replaced by fratricidal warfare. For 11 years, from 1402 to 1430, the brothers fought. Alliances were made and broken. The Byzantine emperor, who had been on the verge of annihilation, now cleverly played one brother against another, prolonging the conflict to ensure his own survival. It seemed as though the Ottoman story, which had begun with such promise, would end here, in a bloody footnote of civil war. The Gazi state was consuming itself. But one of Bayezid's sons possessed the same patience and strategic cunning as his great-grandfather Osman. His name was Mehmed. While his brothers exhausted themselves in furious campaigns, Mehmed consolidated his power base in Anatolia. He waited, he planned, and he outlasted his rivals. One by one his brothers fell. After a final, decisive battle, Mehmed emerged as the sole, undisputed victor. In 1430, the Ottoman interregnum was over. Mehmed I now stood as the master of the Ottoman realm. But the realm was in ruins. The treasury was empty. The provinces were in chaos, and the army was a fraction of its former strength. He had won the war for his father's throne, but he had inherited a ghost of an empire. History would come to call him the second founder of the Ottoman state. He had pulled it back from the brink of non-existence. As he surveyed his shattered inheritance, he faced a monumental task, not of conquest, but of reconstruction. He had to rebuild the dream of Osman, to reforge the broken sword of the Gazi state, and to ensure that the house his ancestors had built would never again come so close to utter collapse. The work of a second beginning was at hand. Chapter 2. The sinews of the state, so brutally torn by civil war, began to knit themselves together once more. Under the patient hand of Mehmed I, the Ottoman realm entered a period not of spectacular conquest, but of quiet, essential healing. The treasury was slowly refilled. The loyalty of the provinces was carefully resecured. The army, shattered at Ankara, was reconstituted, its discipline restored, its ranks replenished. This was a different kind of power being forged. It was not the raw, chaotic energy of the early Ghazi warriors, but something more measured, more centralized. It was the power of a settled state, learning the hard lessons of its own near destruction. For nearly 4 decades, through the reign of Mehmed and his successor, this patient work of restoration continued. The frontiers expanded, but cautiously. The old enemies were engaged, but prudently. The great prize, the city that had haunted the dreams of Islamic conquerors for 8 centuries, was left undisturbed. It sat across the narrow waters of the Bosphorus, a jewel of fading brilliance, waiting. In the year 1451, a new sultan ascended the throne. He was young, just 19 years of age, but he possessed an intellect and a will that seemed forged from a harder metal than that of ordinary men. His name was also Mehmed, but history would know him by another title, Fatih, the Conqueror. From his earliest days, Mehmed II had been consumed by a single, all-encompassing ambition. He was a student of history, fluent in multiple languages, a reader of the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar. He saw himself not merely as a king of the Turks, but as a successor to the Roman emperors. And to claim that legacy, he knew he must possess its ancient heart. He must take Constantinople. His accession marked the dawn of what historians now call the classical period of the Ottoman military. The army was no longer a coalition of tribal warriors and frontier raiders. It was a sophisticated, professional fighting force, its core, the disciplined Janissary infantry, its logistics meticulously planned, its command structure absolute. Mehmed did not hide his intentions. He began preparations for the great siege almost immediately. On the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite a fortress built by his great-grandfather, Mehmed ordered the construction of a new castle. It was called Rumeli Hisar, the Fortress of Europe. Built in a matter of months, its cannons now commanded the narrowest point of the strait, cutting off the city from any potential aid from the Black Sea. It was a stone declaration of war. To the desperate pleas of the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, Mehmed simply replied that the Sultan was master on his own lands. Then came the weapons. Mehmed sought out a Hungarian cannon founder named Orban, a master of his craft, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines. They could not afford his price. Mehmed could. He gave Orban workshops, unlimited resources, and a single command: build him a cannon that could batter down the legendary walls of Constantinople. The result was a monster of bronze, a supergun nearly 30 feet long, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing over half a ton for more than a mile. It was said that 60 oxen were needed to drag it into position and hundreds of men to service it. It was the physical embodiment of the Sultan's will. A force of terrifying, unprecedented power, aimed at the heart of the old world. In the spring of 1403 the siege began. A vast army, perhaps 80,000 strong, surrounded the land walls of the city. A fleet of over 100 ships blockaded its harbour, and the great guns, including Orban's behemoth, began their methodical, soul-shaking work. The sound of the bombardment, contemporaries wrote, could be heard for 100 miles. For the 7,000 defenders huddled within the walls, it was the sound of the world ending. The Theodosian walls had stood for 1,000 years. They had repelled every army that had ever come against them, but they had never faced a power like this. Day after day the stone cannonballs smashed into the ancient ramparts, grinding them down, opening breaches that the defenders would desperately repair under the cover of darkness. Yet the city held. The defenders, a mix of Greeks, Genoese, and Venetians, fought with the courage of despair. The Ottoman fleet was blocked from entering the city's natural harbour, the Golden Horn, by a massive iron chain stretched across its mouth. For weeks a stalemate seemed to settle in. The Sultan's impatience grew. It was then that Mehmed conceived of a plan so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that it has echoed through military history ever since. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn, they would travel there by land. He ordered a road of greased logs to be constructed over the hill of Galata. Under the cover of a single night, his engineers and thousands of labourers, using oxen and sheer human strength, hauled more than 70 of his smaller warships out of the Bosphorus, up the steep hill, and down the other side, splashing them into the waters of the Golden Horn. When the sun rose, the defenders of Constantinople looked out upon a miracle and a nightmare. The Ottoman fleet was now inside their harbour, behind the great chain. Their last line of defence had been outflanked by an act of sheer, indomitable will. The psychological blow was devastating. The end was now certain. On the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault began. Before dawn, the waves of attackers threw themselves at the battered walls. The fighting was ferocious, a desperate struggle in the dark. The great cannon had opened a gaping wound in the wall, and it was here that the final drama played out. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine, was seen fighting and dying in the breach, a Roman emperor to the very end. As the sun rose, the crimson banner of the Sultan was raised over the city. Constantinople had fallen. Sultan Mehmed II rode into the city that afternoon. He was not triumphant, but sombre. He passed through the ruined streets, through scenes of plunder that he had permitted for 3 days, as was the custom of the age. He rode to the city's spiritual heart, the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Dismounting, he walked into the vast echoing space. He stooped, tradition tells us, and gathered a handful of earth, which he sprinkled over his turban as an act of humility before God. He gazed up at the magnificent dome, which seemed to float weightlessly above him. He ordered that the mosaics be covered with plaster, and that a minaret be built. He then summoned an imam, who ascended the pulpit and recited the Islamic call to prayer. The great cathedral was now a mosque. The city, he declared, would have a new name, Istanbul. It would be the capital of his empire. The conquest was a world historical event. It sent a shockwave across Christendom and the Islamic world alike. For the Ottomans, it was the fulfillment of a divine promise, the ultimate victory of the Gazi faith. But Mehmed was more than a warrior. He was a statesman. He knew that a city of ghosts could not be the capital of an empire. He needed to repopulate it, to make it thrive once more. And so, in an act of remarkable foresight, he turned to the city's remaining foreign merchants. To the Genoese of Galata, he offered the first of what would be known as the capitulations. He granted them the right to trade freely, to be governed by their own laws, and to practice their own religion. A year later, in 1454, a similar treaty was granted to the Venetians. These were agreements made from a position of absolute strength. They were concessions from a conqueror, designed to harness the economic vitality of the West for the benefit of his new capital. They were a practical solution to an immediate problem. No one could have known that these same agreements, centuries later, would become tools for European powers to exert influence, to erode Ottoman sovereignty, and to slowly pry the empire apart. They were seeds of a distant future, planted in the soil of a great triumph. As Mehmed stood in his new capital, the world had been remade. The last vestige of the Roman Empire was gone. The Ottoman Sultan was no longer a regional power, but a true Caesar, an emperor straddling 2 continents, his authority cemented by the capture of the world's most coveted city. He had conquered the dream. Now he faced the far greater challenge, to build an empire worthy of it. Chapter 3. For a generation after the fall of Constantinople, the empire expanded, its borders pushed outward by the force of Mehmed's will. But upon his death in 1481, a quiet inertia seemed to settle over the court. His successor was a man of contemplation, not conquest. And for 3 decades the great machine of the Ottoman state idled. Yet within the palace a different kind of energy was building, a terrible and necessary energy, coiled in the person of the Sultan's youngest son, Selim. Where his father was pious and hesitant, Selim was ambitious and utterly ruthless. He saw weakness in the states in action, and danger gathering on its eastern frontier. He forced his father from the throne, secured his own accession through the chillingly effective means of fratricide, and turned the empire's gaze away from Europe. For Selim, the true threat was not in Vienna or Rome, but in Persia, where a new Shia dynasty, the Safavids, had risen to challenge Ottoman authority and religious orthodoxy. His reign was a whirlwind of violence, earning him the epithet Yavuz, a word that means not simply the grim, but the stern, the steadfast, the unyielding. After shattering the Safavid army in 1514, Selim pivoted south toward the ancient and decadent Mamluk Sultanate, which had dominated Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina for centuries. In 2 decisive battles, the Ottoman tide swept away the last great Arab power. The Mamluk cavalry, famed for its skill and courage, was broken by the disciplined fire of Janissaries and the thunder of Ottoman cannon. By 1517, Selim stood as master of Cairo. This was more than a conquest. It was a fundamental reordering of the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire had, in a single campaign, doubled its territory and its population. But more than that, Selim inherited the Mamluks' most sacred charge, the guardianship of the holy cities. The last shadow caliph of the Abbasid line, a resident of Cairo, duly transferred his authority to the Ottoman Sultan. The sword of the Ghazi warrior was now joined to the mantle of the caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. The empire was no longer just a European power or an Anatolian state. It was the undisputed center of the Islamic world. Selim was preparing to turn this newly consolidated power back toward the west, planning an invasion of Rhodes, when fate intervened. In 1520, as his armies gathered, the fearsome Sultan, the man who had remade the map of the Middle East, was struck down not by an assassin's blade or a battlefield wound, but by a simple skin infection that turned septic. His 8-year reign had been a brutal, bloody, and transformative storm. And now the storm had passed. In its wake, a single heir remained, a 25-year-old man named Suleiman. To the courts of Europe, who had trembled at the name of Selim, the ascension of his son was a source of relief. Suleiman was known as a quiet, scholarly figure, more interested in books and law than in his father's relentless campaigns. They mistook his calm for weakness. They were soon to be disabused of the notion. Suleiman had inherited all of his father's ambition, but tempered it with a genius for administration, a love of justice, and a grand imperial vision that would define the age. His first act was a clear statement of intent. In 1521, he marched his army north to the fortress of Belgrade, the gateway to Hungary. It was the very fortress that had defied his great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror. Where Mehmed had failed, Suleiman succeeded. The walls were breached, the garrison surrendered, and the key to Central Europe was now in Ottoman hands. The road to Budapest and Vienna lay open. Next he turned to the sea. For decades the Knights of St. John, a militant Christian order of warrior monks, had used the island of Rhodes as a fortress and a base for piracy, preying on Ottoman shipping and pilgrim vessels. They were a thorn in the side of the empire, a remnant of the Crusades that could no longer be tolerated. In 1522, Suleiman landed a vast army on the island and began a siege that would last for 6 brutal months. The knights, led by their stoic Grand Master, put up a defense of legendary courage, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Ottoman engineers tunneled beneath the massive walls, while the great cannons reduced stone fortifications to dust. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers fell to disease and in the desperate fighting. But Suleiman's will was absolute. On the first day of 1523, the surviving knights were permitted to sail away, a gesture of pragmatism from a sultan who wanted their island, not their martyrdom. The eastern Mediterranean was now, for all intents and purposes, an Ottoman lake. The great contest, however, was on land. In the summer of 1526, Suleiman led the imperial army, perhaps 100,000 strong, onto the plains of Hungary. At a place called Mohacs, the Hungarian king, young and fatally arrogant, marshalled his army of knights. Clad in brilliant plate armour, they charged the Ottoman lines, expecting to sweep the enemy from the field as their ancestors had done. Instead, they rode into a perfectly executed trap. The Ottoman centre gave way, luring the knights deeper before the wings closed in around them. Cannons, firing at point-blank range, tore horrific gaps in their ranks, and the disciplined Janissaries finished the work. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. In that time a kingdom died. The king, his bishops, and the flower of Hungarian nobility lay dead in the muddy fields. The victory was so complete, so utterly devastating, that it sent a shock wave of terror through Europe. Suleiman had not just defeated an army, he had erased a nation from the map. 3 years later, in 1529, he stood before the walls of Vienna. This was the ultimate prize, the capital of the Habsburgs, the seat of his great rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Ottoman army, at the very end of its long supply lines, battered the city. But the defenders held. And more importantly, the weather turned. The autumn rains began, turning the roads to mud and threatening the army's retreat. Suleiman, ever the pragmatist, recognized the impossible. He had reached the limit. The next decades were a long, grinding struggle for supremacy, fought on a global scale. Suleiman and Charles V, the two most powerful men in the world, battled for control of the Mediterranean, of North Africa, of Hungary. The empire was a world state, fighting Persians in the mountains of Iraq and the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. Its internal order was the envy of Europe. An imperial ambassador, Ogier Giselin de Busbecq, wrote with a mixture of admiration and fear of the Ottoman system, a true meritocracy, where a man's position was determined by his ability, not his birth. He saw a state of immense discipline and purpose, and he warned his masters that Europe, divided and decadent, was ill prepared to face it. But time, the enemy of all empires, was beginning to work against the Ottomans. The era of easy victories was passing. In 1565, Suleiman, now an old man, sought to finish the work he had begun at Rhodes 40 years earlier. He sent a massive fleet to dislodge the Knights of St. John from their new island fortress, Malta. But the knights, seared by the memory of Rhodes, had built a bastion of almost unimaginable strength. The great siege of Malta was a bloody 4-month epic of endurance and savagery. This time it was the Ottomans who were repulsed. Their finest troops shattered against the island's defences, their fleet forced to sail home in defeat. It was a strategic check, a sign that the balance of power in the sea was beginning, ever so slowly, to shift. 1 year later, in 1566, Suleiman, now 71 years old and racked by gout, insisted on leading his army one last time. The target was a minor fortress in Hungary, Sigedvar, whose defiance had angered the aged Sultan. He was too frail to ride a horse, carried instead in a litter, a ghost presiding over the magnificent army he had led for nearly half a century. He directed the siege from his tent, a mind still sharp within a failing body. The fortress was about to fall. The final assault was being prepared. But on the night of September the 7th, in the quiet solitude of the imperial tent, the longest and most magnificent reign in Ottoman history came to an end. The Sultan died, not from a wound, but from the simple exhaustion of a life lived at the centre of the world. His Grand Vizier, knowing that news of his master's death would break the army's spirit, made a fateful decision. The Sultan's passing would be a state secret. An aide entered the tent, and in the flickering lamplight saw the still form of the lawgiver, the magnificent, the master of the age. The shadow that had stretched from the walls of Vienna to the plains of Persia had finally passed. An era was over. Chapter 4. For an empire, as for a man, the passing of a great soul does not mean the immediate cessation of life. The vast machinery of the state, built over centuries, continued to turn. The armies still marched, the tax collectors made their rounds, and the Sultan's decrees were still read in the far-flung mosques of Damascus and Cairo. But the ghost of Suleiman lingered over the court, a silent measure against which his successors would be judged and found wanting. The slow, creeping illness that would afflict the empire for the next 3 centuries did not begin with a single dramatic event. It was a quiet decay, a gradual loosening of the discipline that had been the state's very sinew. The meritocracy that had so astonished European observers began to fray, as high office became something to be purchased rather than earned. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's peerless soldiers, slowly transformed into a privileged, parasitic class, more interested in palace intrigue and commerce than in battlefield glory. This internal weakening coincided with a subtle yet profound shift in the empire's relationship with the outside world. The capitulations, those trade privileges first granted by Mehmed the Conqueror from a position of absolute strength, began to change their character. In 1673, the agreement with France was renewed and expanded. On the surface, it was a simple treaty of commerce and friendship. But buried in its clauses was a new reality. The Ottoman state was no longer dictating terms, it was negotiating them. European merchants, diplomats, and missionaries operated within the empire under the protection of their own laws, creating small islands of foreign sovereignty that slowly eroded the Sultan's authority. The seeds planted in the soil of a great triumph had begun to sprout into something entirely different. The world outside the empire's borders was changing with a terrifying velocity. While the Ottoman state struggled with the inertia of its own glorious past, the nations of Europe were being reforged in the fires of scientific revolution, political upheaval, and industrialization. New forms of military organization, new technologies of war, and new sources of wealth gave them an ever-increasing advantage. The balance of power, which had for so long favoured the Sultan, was irrevocably tilting. The most glaring proof of this new reality came not from a foreign power, but from within the empire itself. In the province of Egypt, a brilliant and ruthless Ottoman governor named Muhammad Ali Pasha had watched the rise of Europe with a keen eye. An Albanian officer of humble origins, he saw with perfect clarity that the old ways were a recipe for extinction. He systematically remade Egypt in the European image, building a modern conscripted army, founding factories, and establishing new schools. He accomplished what the central government in Istanbul could only dream of. His success became a mortal threat. Muhammad Ali's modernized army crushed Ottoman forces sent to contain him, and he established a dynasty that would rule Egypt in all but name for the next century and a half. He was a living embodiment of the empire's decay. A provincial servant who had become more modern, more efficient, and more powerful than his own master. The message was unmistakable: reform or be consumed. The Sultan who heard this message most clearly was Mahmud II. Ascending the throne in the early 19th century, he inherited a state on the verge of collapse. He understood that the greatest obstacle to any meaningful reform was not a foreign enemy, but the very institution that was supposed to be the empire's sword and shield, the Janissary Corps. For generations, the Janissaries had been a state within the state. They were kingmakers and kingbreakers, a corrupt and entitled military caste that strangled any attempt at modernization which threatened their privileges. They were no longer the disciplined terror of Christendom, but a mob in uniform, a cancer that had to be excised if the patient was to have any hope of survival. In the summer of 1826, Mahmud made his move. After provoking the Janissaries into a predictable revolt, he was ready. Loyal artillery units, trained in secret, were brought to the capital. As the Janissaries poured into the streets, the cannons opened fire on their barracks. The ancient institution, which had been founded in the 14th century, was systematically and brutally annihilated. The event was given a name in Ottoman chronicles, the Vaka-i Hayri, the Auspicious Incident. It was a bloody, violent, and desperate act of surgery. With the Janissaries gone, the path to reform was finally clear. The destruction of the Janissaries inaugurated a new era in Ottoman history, a period of sweeping, top-down modernization known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization. For the next several decades, a series of decrees attempted to remake the very foundations of the state. A new European-style army was created. The administration was centralized. The legal and tax systems were overhauled with the radical goal of making all subjects of the empire, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, equal before the law. The aim was to forge a new identity, Ottomanism, a shared sense of citizenship that could bind the empire's dizzyingly diverse peoples together and resist the siren song of nationalism that was echoing from Europe. It was a noble, and perhaps impossible, dream. The reforms were expensive, often poorly implemented, and resisted by those who saw them as a threat to tradition. More critically, the Tanzimat era deepened the empire's reliance on the very European powers it sought to emulate. To fund the reforms, the government took out massive loans from British and French banks, falling into a spiral of debt that would eventually lead to foreign control over its finances. The cure, it seemed, was entwined with the disease. The empire was being kept alive, but at the cost of its own independence. By the latter half of the 19th century, the Eastern question, the question of what to do with the decaying Ottoman Empire, dominated European diplomacy. The empire was now widely known by a new, unfortunate title, the sick man of Europe. The diagnosis was delivered, and the great powers gathered like physicians around a deathbed, each with their own prescription, and each hoping to inherit a portion of the estate. The brutal reality of the empire's condition was laid bare in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. The newly reformed Ottoman army fought bravely, but was ultimately crushed by the Russian military machine. The defeat was catastrophic. The treaty that followed stripped the empire of vast territories in the Balkans, lands it had held for nearly 500 years. In the wake of this disaster, the great powers convened the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Presided over by the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, the Congress was a stark illustration of the empire's diminished status. The fate of Ottoman lands was decided not in Istanbul, but in a conference hall in Germany. Bismarck, acting as the honest broker, oversaw the redrawing of the map of southeastern Europe. New nations were born, old provinces were handed to Austria-Hungary, and Britain was granted control of Cyprus. The Ottoman delegates could do little but watch as their empire was dismembered. The Sultan who presided over this period of relentless crisis was Abdulhamid II. A deeply paranoid and autocratic ruler, he suspended the fledgling Ottoman constitution and ruled by decree. Yet he was not a simple reactionary. He desperately tried to hold his crumbling empire together, using the new technologies of the age, the telegraph and the railway, to enforce his will from the center. He promoted a policy of pan-Islamism, hoping to use the authority of the caliphate to unite the Muslim world against European encroachment. It was a last, desperate attempt to find a new source of strength, a new foundation for the ancient state. But it was too little, and far too late. The 20th century dawned on an empire that was a shadow of its former self. Decades of reform and repression had failed to halt the decline. Humiliation at the hands of foreign powers and frustration with the Sultan's autocracy created a fertile ground for revolution. A new movement arose, known to the world as the Young Turks. They were a coalition of disaffected army officers, students, and exiled intellectuals who shared a common dream: to restore the constitution and build a modern, strong, and revitalized Turkish state. In 1908, their revolution forced Sultan Abdulhamid to restore the constitution, and a year later he was deposed and sent into exile. A wave of optimism swept the empire. For a moment it seemed as if a new dawn was possible. But the Young Turk movement was itself a fractured alliance of liberals, nationalists, and hard-headed military men. As the empire continued to lose territory in a series of disastrous Balkan wars, the most ruthless and determined faction seized control. Power coalesced around a triumvirate of three men: Enver Pasha, the ambitious Minister of War; Talat Pasha, the formidable Minister of the Interior; and Cemal Pasha, the stern Minister of the Marine. They were men of action, patriots who believed that the empire's salvation lay in decisive, centralized control and an aggressive foreign policy. They looked upon a world that was sliding inexorably towards a great cataclysmic war. They saw the old alliances that had dominated the 19th century, the empire's traditional reliance on Britain and France, as a trap. They sought a new patron, a new model of military and industrial might. Their gaze fell upon Imperial Germany. In the halls of power in Istanbul, with the fate of a 600-year-old empire in their hands, they made their choice. They would steer their fragile, exhausted state into an alliance with the Central Powers, directly into the heart of the coming storm. Chapter 5. The final act did not begin with a single dramatic thunderclap, but with the quiet, rhythmic sound of marching feet. In the autumn of 1914, columns of Ottoman soldiers, Anatolian Turks, Arabs from the Levant, Kurds from the eastern mountains, moved towards the empire's frontiers. They marched for a sultan who was now a shadow, and for a caliphate whose authority was wielded by other men. They marched for an empire whose very borders were already being redrawn, in secret, by diplomats in London and Paris, with pencils and rulers on maps that treated ancient lands as empty spaces. The decision had been made. The triumvirate of Enver, Talat, and Cemal Pasha had steered the fragile state into the maelstrom of the Great War on the side of the Central Powers. It was a gamble for survival, a desperate bid to reclaim sovereignty and throw off the yoke of European economic control. But it would prove to be a death warrant, signed in triplicate. Enver Pasha, the ambitious Minister of War, dreamed of a new pan-Turanic empire stretching into Central Asia. In the winter of 1914, he led the Third Army into the Caucasus Mountains against the Russians. The campaign was a catastrophe. At the Battle of Sarikamish, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death in the snowbound passes, victims of poor planning and hubris. The defeat shattered Enver's dream, and in the halls of power in Istanbul, a dark paranoia took root. A scapegoat was needed, and one had long been prepared. The Christian Armenian population of the eastern provinces, who lived astride the sensitive border with Russia, were cast as a disloyal fifth column. In the spring of 1915, the government of the Young Turks, with Minister of the Interior Talat Pasha as its chief architect, set in motion a plan of breathtaking brutality. It was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a cold, systematic, state-organized policy of annihilation. The machinery of the state was turned to this terrible purpose. First, Armenian soldiers serving in the Ottoman army were disarmed and moved into labour battalions, where most were worked to death or executed. Then, on a single night in April, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, community leaders and clergy were arrested in Istanbul and deported to the interior, where they were murdered. The head of the community had been severed. What followed was the emptying of a homeland. Across Anatolia, Armenian men of military age were rounded up and killed. The women, the children, and the elderly were ordered from their homes with only what they could carry. They were told they were being relocated for their own safety. Instead, they were marched in vast, wretched columns south toward the Syrian desert. There was no food, no water, no shelter. The guards who drove them on encouraged local tribesmen to attack the helpless convoys. Those who fell by the roadside were left to die. Thousands were driven into the Euphrates River to drown. By 1917, the Armenian presence in Anatolia, which had endured for nearly 3,000 years, had been effectively extinguished. It was a crime that would give a new, terrible word to the human language: genocide. While the empire was consuming itself in the east, it was beginning to fracture in the south. For centuries, the Ottoman Sultan had also been the caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. It was a bond that had held the Arab provinces, however loosely, to Istanbul. But the siren song of nationalism, which had already stripped the empire of its Balkan territories, was now echoing through the deserts of Arabia. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the guardian of the holy cities, raised the banner of the Arab revolt. Encouraged and supplied by the British and advised by men like T.E. Lawrence, Arab forces attacked the Hejaz Railway, tying down Ottoman troops and challenging the very legitimacy of the Sultan Caliph's rule. They fought for the promise of a great independent Arab kingdom, stretching from Aleppo to Aden. But their allies were playing a different game. Even as Lawrence was making promises in the desert, British diplomat Mark Sykes and his French counterpart, François-Georges Picot, were meeting in secret. With the consent of Russia, they carved up the Ottoman Arab provinces between themselves. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq and Palestine. The promise of an Arab kingdom was a mirage. The lines they drew on their map would become the troubled borders of the modern Middle East. By the autumn of 1918, the Ottoman Empire was broken. Its armies were in retreat on every front. Bulgaria's surrender left Istanbul exposed. Defeated and exhausted, the government signed an armistice. The Great War was over. Allied warships steamed through the Dardanelles and anchored in the Bosphorus, their guns trained on the domes and minarets of the imperial capital. The Sultan was a prisoner in his own palace. The young Turk triumvirate fled into exile. The 600-year-old empire was now a ghost. Its provinces were under foreign occupation. Its government was powerless. For the Turkish people of Anatolia, it was a moment of profound humiliation, a final, bitter confirmation of the title they had long resented. The sick man of Europe was dead. But from the ashes of this imperial collapse, a new fire was kindled. A single general, a man who had earned his fame as the one commander to win a major victory against the Allies at Gallipoli, refused to accept the dismemberment of his homeland. His name was Mustafa Kemal. He was not an Ottoman loyalist fighting to save the Sultan. He was a Turkish nationalist, a pragmatist, a modernizer. He slipped out of occupied Istanbul and travelled to the Anatolian heartland, where he began to organize a national resistance. This was not a war to restore the empire, but to forge a new nation. For 3 years, his nationalist forces fought a war of independence against the Greek army, which had landed in the west with Allied backing to enforce a punitive peace treaty. In 1922, the Turkish armies drove the last of the occupying forces from Anatolian soil. In November of that year, the new Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. After 623 years, the House of Osman had fallen. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, slipped aboard a British warship and sailed into exile. A year later, in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. He would be given a new name, Ataturk, Father of the Turks. The final link to the past was severed in 1924, when the Caliphate, the last vestige of Ottoman religious authority, was also abolished. Ataturk set his new nation on a revolutionary course of secularism and westernization, deliberately turning its back on the imperial, multi-ethnic and Islamic past. The Sublime Porte was closed forever. Its vast territories were gone, partitioned into a constellation of new states and colonial mandates. The story of the Ottoman Empire was over. And yet the story is never truly over. The past is not a closed book, but a lingering presence, an echo in the chambers of the present. Today, the lines drawn in secret a century ago by Sykes and Picot are the contested borders of Syria and Iraq, frontiers of conflict and instability. In the sprawling, vibrant city of Istanbul, the minarets of the sultans share the skyline with the glass towers of global finance, and the status of the Hagia Sophia, once the great church of Christendom, then the premier mosque of the empire, then a secular museum, and now a mosque once more, remains a symbol of a deep and unresolved argument about the nation's soul. Tourists now walk through the quiet courtyards of the Topkapi Palace, peering at the jewels and relics of a vanished world. They stand in the rooms where Suleiman the Magnificent governed a global power, where decisions were made that shook the world from Vienna to Persia. The empire has become a museum, a memory, a story told to visitors from lands that were once its distant provinces or its mortal enemies. But the memory is not confined to museums. In the charged atmosphere of a modern political rally, a leader invokes the glory of the Ottoman past, calling upon its legacy to fuel contemporary ambitions. The ghost of the empire is a potent force, a source of pride for some, a warning for others, a complex inheritance that Turkey and the wider world are still learning how to live with. From Osman's dream of a single tree whose branches covered the world to the last sultan's lonely departure into exile, the arc of the Ottoman state was a testament to the enduring cycles of history. It was a story of how a small band of frontier warriors could build a world power, how that power could reach a golden age of law and culture, and how, through a long, slow, and painful decline, it could be consumed by the very forces of modernity it struggled to master. The empire is gone. Its palaces are silent. But its echoes are all around us, in the headlines of our newspapers, in the lines on our maps, and in the deep, unquiet memory of the world it helped to shape.